Good morning, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to this joint Southeast Asia Urban Development and Water Supply Division and the Economic Analysis and Operational Support Division, EREA, side event at the Asia Forum 2022. This side event is an example of a 1ADB collaboration in developing knowledge products and in knowledge management in action. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the SEW, the Southeast Asia Urban and Water Division, and the Economic Analysis and Operations Support Division, EREA, colleagues for making this happen. It's a very timely discussion today because the socioeconomic surveys plays an important role in project design. They provide useful information on the current situation in project areas and provide feedback on the acceptability and demand for the investment. Surveys are most often conducted at the preparation and appraisal phase to give an early indication whether the project is feasible or not. For this reason, developing high quality survey tools are utmost importance to ADB. Having said that, let me now provide a little bit of a background on the origin of the side event. In February this year, the Southeast Asia Urban and Water Division launched a guide for socioeconomic surveys for urban development and water supply projects. While this document was initially prepared for internal purposes, we are pleased to state that this would now be launched as a product that will be available for download on the ADB website. Similarly, late last year in December, EREA launched a guide for conducting field surveys that capture the willingness to pay for non-market goods. This handbook also will be out later this year. With these two projects that I mentioned, in this session, we will focus to provide a quick overview of the two key publications and give you a quick masterclass of how to conduct good field surveys, including how to accurately capture willingness to pay. We hope to allocate sufficient time for any Q&As after the presentations, and I would really like to welcome and encourage everyone to take this opportunity and interact with our expert. You can either do that by coming off mute and then ask the question directly, or write your questions in the chat box, and one of our speakers will then be able to take on those questions and be able to respond to you. With that, let me once again thank everyone for joining this session this morning. And I'm really looking forward to fruitful conversation and discussion. Over to the organization. Thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words in the beginning. Thank you.
Thanks, Srini. So I'm taking over right now. Let me share my screen for my presentation. Hang on. Could you see my screen? Yes?
Yes, Amy.
All right. Thank you so much. So as Srini mentioned, first of all, my name is Amy Hampel. I'm an economist at the Economic Analysis and Operational Support Division, and our job is to review the economic analysis of projects. So as Srini mentioned, we have two publications, the CVM publication and the survey guide publication. And we are going to come up with a guide for both. And this is going to be a master class because they have overlapping topics. And we figured it would be best to reach out and to showcase what the two publications have. So I have the simplest task, actually, together with Trang, my colleague. We will be presenting this new publication. And then later on, Jindra and Del will go towards a deep dive of the implementing field surveys, and Asa and David will go on a deep dive on the contingent valuation methodology, which is used for estimating willingness to pay. So the focus of our presentation here for Trang and me is to give you an overview of the book that is going to come out very soon, and then also to show you how we can apply this unique survey toolkit that we developed, the EREA and SEUW. Okay, so the book contains basically 5 sections. The first is on socioeconomic surveys and the ADB project cycle. This will be discussed in depth by Jindra in the next presentation. I'll give a very quick overview about that. My presentation, as I said, will focus on common mistakes in survey questionnaires. Then we will identify what are core and expanded questions. When we implement surveys, what are the core and what are expanded questions? Are expanded questions necessary for questionnaires, for surveys? Fourth, we will show pre-survey and survey implementation guidelines. So after we've spent so much time perfecting our questionnaires, what do we do in the field before and after going to the field so that the survey will give us very good quality data that we could use later on. That will be given by also by Jindra and Del. And then I will just briefly show what it looks like, the curve, the core and expanded questions. And then Trang will show how to apply it with the use of technology for GIS and envisioning the data that we gathered on a map. Okay, so very briefly, the ADB project cycle. This is presented in the book. The survey is located very early on, as we could see, and it is very important because it builds on other steps in the project processing and also on the other documents that are necessary, as well as the due diligence requirements. And so we explain why surveys are very important in the book. Second, we show what are the different mistakes that are being made in survey questionnaires. What we did here is we reviewed 18 ADB questionnaires, and we found some mistakes, but also other questionnaires, of course, some mistakes that are common across all these questionnaires that we wanted to highlight so that we could avoid them. So first is lack of standardized questions. Standardizing means using the same words or terminologies when referring to a specific topic across a questionnaire. So Jindra will give some more examples on this, so I won't dwell on that. The second is when we ask too many questions. So we understand that researchers would want to include as many questions in the questionnaire as possible so that they will get more data. However, there is a trade-off between the length of the questionnaire and the quality of the data, as well as the quality of the response that we will get. So if surveys are too long and too complex and too confusing, they can potentially lead to survey fatigue. So disorganized way of asking is a third common mistake. The way questions are structured and organized in a questionnaire is important because it can affect the reliability and consistency of the respondents' answers. It is good practice to group the related questions in one group and ask them sequentially so that the respondents can build upon the questions and build their response upon it. The fourth common mistake is a vague way of asking questions and suggestive questions. Vague questions is when the word or the term, the question is not specific, not clear, and not well defined, such that it is open to interpretation of the respondent. It may be too broad or very difficult to analyze. So, for example, when we ask, how satisfied are you with the quality of your piped water? The quality could be color, smell, frequency, and so on of water supply. So vague questions should be avoided. Suggestive questions are those that are questions that that prompts the respondent to respond in a certain way. And this should also be avoided. So for example, considering the importance of a well-designed septic tank, would you be willing to construct a toilet with a septic tank as stipulated by the law? So the answer would definitely be a yes, because it suggested that septic tanks are important and then the construction is based on the law. So those suggestive questions should be avoided. Fifth is the use of absolutes. So absolute means using words such as always, very, often, or so on in a question. That makes it very inflexible, and there will be a lack of variability in the responses. So for example, the researcher wants to ask the respondent, is water always available from your main source of drinking water? So with always, always is always subject to interpretation, and we don't know what always means to you might not be always to me. So absolutes should be avoided. Sixth is on reliance on memory recall. Questions requiring memory recall are very difficult because it's very difficult for respondents to remember. For example, it would be easier for them to remember 2 weeks ago the incidence of disease from waterborne water incidence of waterborne diseases than something that happened 2 years ago. So as much as possible, we would like to avoid a very long time period between what is being discussed and also what during the interview. All right. The last one is on ignoring cultural differences and sensitivity. So different regions can be sensitive about certain topics, for example, about income, about sanitation and hygiene practices, even about female and male relationships, such that sensitive questions should be asked with care. And this should be, that's why questionnaire should always be in discussion and prepared very well and thought of very well in the context of the community that will be surveyed. So going back to the book will look like this. It has annotated draft questionnaire with core and expanded questions. It has an introduction, it has screener questions, and the blue annotation on the right either gives the interviewer a little bit more understanding on why the question need to be asked or what the question is going to answer, or just guide the enumerator on how to provide the question. So these are guides, the blue ones here are guides for the enumerators. So what we have basically is a modular questionnaire that's very gender sensitive, and basically depending on the output of your project, you can get one part and then combine it with another part and another part. So it's just like Lego. And the questionnaire looks like this, and the red questions are the core questions, which should be found in every questionnaire in the urban development and water supply sector. So this is water, for example. And the black questions are the expanded questions. So it goes like this until the end. And so we did this for water supply, for sanitation, for solid waste management, and for flood management projects until the end. We also uploaded this in the Kobo app, the questionnaire, so it is available. The site is here, where we can access the questionnaire and build our own questionnaire. And this is how it would look like if it was administered using a handy telephone. And so this is very accessible to everyone. Kobo is a free platform use. I'd like to quickly pass on to Trang to explain how we could apply the data that we gathered and visualize our result. Trang? Oh, she's dropped off. All right. Okay. So this is how, let me take over a bit of Trang's part. This is how we visualize the data. So this is not exactly the Kobo app because we use a different app for this, because the book was processed after the data gathering. But this is basically how we can use the data and transpose it with GIS data. This is a project of the Southeast Asian Urban and Development and Water Division in Baguio City, the north of the Philippines, where we showed how many septic tanks are there and how often are they being emptied. And you could see from the blue one, the blue dots means the facility has never been emptied. So, and then for less than 10 years. So facility never emptied for within 10 years, and the red one is facility never emptied more than 10 years. So you could see that a lot more are red, so the facilities are basically not emptied. So juxtaposed with GIS data, the the survey data that we could use has a lot of potential, and we encourage everybody to use this because this is a standardized version. All right, so that's it from my side. I'll pass it on to Jindra and Del for their part on implementing good surveys. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amy. So let me just share my screen. So can you see my screen?
Yes, Jins.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So I'm presenting on behalf also of my colleague, Del Harder. So as Amy presented earlier, in ADB project cycle, surveys are often conducted in several stages. So usually, the initial one is during the preparation and the appraisal phase, and another survey are usually conducted during the implementation and even at the completion and evaluation stage. But for this presentation, let us focus on the field surveys done during the appraisal stage. So one reason why it is important to develop a well-designed survey during the appraisal, it's because it sets the project's baseline and also contributes a lot of information needed for other studies to help improve the project design. As in the case of ADB, these initial surveys provide relevant inputs to other ADB's due diligence requirements, such as the sector assessment report. We have the socioeconomic and poverty assessment report, as well as the conduct of the economic due diligence report, which are all important for the final approval of the loan. For example, in a typical ADB's urban development and water supply project, the project would have a diverse benefit worth capturing to determine the economic viability of the project, such as the willingness to pay for water connection or cost savings you get from water treatment, or even the time savings for which women and children collects water, and many more. All these important economic uh, um, all this important information are relevant for economic valuation or cost benefit analysis. And you can get all this information if your survey is well designed. While it is important to recognize that most surveys are context specific, it is important that there will be similar core investment components that you can compare across different projects. So what are the benefits of having a standardized questionnaire? One is the comparison of data and results, which you can use to allow standardized data reporting and comparison of survey questions across projects with similar interventions. Information about benefits can be collected in the same way across projects, and the data can be analyzed using similar valuation techniques. The second point is reliability. Framing similar questions differently can lead to inconsistencies, and also in terms of how respondents understand or interpret them. So standardizing a measure increases its reliability, and the more frequent the same set of questions are used and validated, the more it is reliable. And then third would be the communication. The use of standardized metrics makes it easier to interpret results and communicate the findings. And then lastly is the generalization from several samples for other projects. With comparable data across projects over time, you can develop metadata that can be used and analyzed to get standardized coefficients that can be used in a similar project or region with a similar type of intervention. So in general, standardizing questions allows researchers to generalize behavior patterns. So, okay, as mentioned earlier by the first speaker, ADB Survey Toolkit tried to standardize questions that are relevant for a typical ADB urban and water supply project. So, as Amy mentioned, uh, what we did was we reviewed several ADB project survey reports and questionnaires, and also reviewed other reference materials such as the WHO and UNICEF's Joint Monitoring Program for Water Supply, Sanitation, and Hygiene Survey document, as well as the multiple indicator cluster surveys. These two references are used globally to monitor and report related water supply sanitation indicators and parameters. So after some extensive reviews, we then try to identify the usual core and expanded questions that are helpful for ADB project appraisal objectives. So because we're in area, um, economic analysis is one of the due diligence requirements in ADB. We also made reference to the World Bank's Economics of Sanitation Initiative Region Survey, or the ESI, and other several ADB socioeconomic survey for urban development and water supply project to identify additional survey questions that are relevant to guide the conduct of economic benefit valuation. So as you can see, the survey toolkit now then presents two sets of questions. First are the core questions. These are basic questions on water, urban, sanitation, and also it encompasses questions that cover solid waste and flood management that are common to many ADB projects. This allows data comparability across project components. Then secondly, the toolkit presents various sets of expanded questions, which include a larger set of questions that are intended to be more robust uh, in terms of finding other information that are important for economic analysis. And also, some expanded questions also refer to other related policy assessment questions. So the toolkit presents a list of expanded questions that may be integrated into a questionnaire depending on the type of the project intervention that is included. Like what Amy mentioned, it's sort of like a Lego, wherein you have kind of like, a core question, and every time you have a different project component, there's like several different sets of questions that you could integrate into the core question. So, like in the earlier slide, Amy presented an example of the annotated questionnaire, presenting both these core and expanded questions in one survey. And then the toolkit also provides several, the one in the blue letters that Amy showed earlier are the guidelines that, the designer would need to know when creating a good questionnaire. So now let's go discuss some key guidelines you need to do during the pre-survey implementation. So the first step in questionnaire development is to gather relevant information. That is your first homework. You can do this through conduct of desk reviews, focus group discussion, and key informant interviews. So these are particularly important in validating the information you need to use in your survey, and also when constructing a good description of your project scenario, especially if you intend to incorporate a willingness to pay question or a contingent valuation survey. the questionnaire design would be very important. Then second, you need to design the questionnaire with the end in mind. So what do I mean by this? The decision on what type of questions to include in the survey should ultimately depend on how the data will be used and analyzed. So each question must serve a purpose. The questionnaire should also allow disaggregation of results by relevant socioeconomic variables and contribute to a more in-depth economic analysis. Then the third is to ensure the sampling methodology. That it accurately represents the target population. There should be a reasonable representation of subgroups of special policy of interest, such as the different income groups or status of household connections of pipe water supplies. There are several techniques for sampling. It can be done through random, stratified, cluster, or even doing a systematic sampling. So selecting subjects to be surveyed can be done through an up-to-date list or random selection using the GIS-based applications. And in taking sampling, sample size must be sufficiently large enough to enable analysis of the results with an acceptable confidence level. Then the fourth step would be to select an appropriate survey method to use. So survey methods may include face-to-face interviews, online surveys, telephone surveys, and self-administered surveys. Like during the time of the pandemic, what worked well were the telephone surveys and the self-administered surveys. So the face-to-face surveys could make use of a pen and paper or the use of a computer-assisted personal interviews, or what we all know as CAPI. CAPI platforms such as the Kobo Toolbox and ADB Spade offers greater benefit to minimize errors and mistakes when conducting the survey. Then the fifth, you need to carefully select and train survey team to improve the quality of data collection. The selection process may include initial interviews to screen qualified enumerators. They may be invited by the project team to join the enumerators training so that you could assess their performance on the field. So the pre-test training is designed to equip enumerators in conducting high-quality interviews and in properly observing survey protocols. It will be also ideal if you could develop a training manual that would serve as a reference guide or sort of like a good reference guide for the survey teams during the enumerators training, the pre-test, and even in the actual survey implementation. So the enumerators also need proper training, particularly in the way they communicate the project scenario and question the respondents. It should be accurate, neutral, clear, to minimize potential bias. Where CAPI, this is where CAPI offers a very good potential in terms of standardizing the way the information is presented to respondents so that you could avoid enumerator bias. And then the sixth would be to conduct a thorough pre-test. This is very important because it avoids problems in the field survey implementation. So pre-testing from a smaller sample of the target population is an important step in refining the content, the cohesiveness, the clarity of the questionnaire before it is used in the actual survey. It also equips enumerators in their understanding of the survey questions. Also helps them in terms of, recording properly the responses to the CAPI if they're using that tool. And also for them to test if the skip instructions in the questionnaire are correct or easy to follow. So pretests also help determine the information in your survey. Refine the survey design to fit the project circumstances. And then the several pretest iterations are usually required to finalize your survey instruments and ensure that you collect the right data. So, and then the last would be if you're working on in an area wherein English is not the local language, it would be worthy to translate your questionnaire to the local language and also do back translation. Because sometimes respondents are more comfortable when the survey is conducted using their local dialects, because there are some special terms in terms of like the water supply facilities that they could really relate to better. Okay, so let's go now to the field survey implementation. So this is what you need to know. First is okay. So first, can you see my slide?
Yes, Jeans.
Okay.
But
so,
we have it's the final slide
sorry,
that I can see.
Let me just go
Yes,
back.
and then
Okay.
please share again. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so let's go now to the field survey implementation. First, you have to carefully plan survey logistic. The survey planning process must consider factors such as the timing of the interview, and then the amount of time needed to coordinate with relevant ministry or city authorities. And also you have to keep in mind also the safety and availability of your enumerators. It is also advisable for enumerators to have a prior knowledge of the culture and practices of the target population to be able to communicate effectively with the respondents. So second would be the observe proper introduction and selection of eligible respondents. Important elements for enumerators to remember is first to give a proper introduction of themselves, the project, and the purpose of why you are conducting the survey. Then second, they must cite the confidentiality clause. And then third, must inform respondents on the duration of the survey if they're willing to stay for that long duration. And then finally, respondent must agree to the survey by signing an informed consent before proceeding with the interview. So eligible respondents to the survey must be defined carefully. These include household heads, water manager, caregiver, and then if the person is not eligible respondent, the enumerator can either end the survey or find a random replacement or set another appointment for when the eligible respondent will be available. Then the third is to conduct interviews following the survey protocol. Enumerators, for example, must avoid doing the interview in groups or in the presence of non-family members. They also need to consider some cultural sensitivities in the project area and the safety of the respondents. Then fourth would be to apply a quality control checks to ensure data validity and reliability. Field supervisors and researchers who are responsible for data checks um, must look out for response patterns, high numbers of outliers, and some inconsistent answers, or even the short survey duration. These are sort of like clues that something wrong is there is something wrong in your survey. The use of copy software, for instance, you need spot checks as well as location and audio audits to avoid some of these problems that may invalidate your survey results. The quality control mechanisms are crucial because not much can be done to correct mistakes if questionnaires are accepted without checking. A prescribed quota per enumerator per day should be identified, but this would depend on the length of your survey instrument. The reason for this, is that is for you to avoid enumerator fatigue. So to end my presentation, I would like to refer you to some important references that you can look at when developing your survey plans. So in summary, the forthcoming ADB survey toolkit provides you an example of a well-designed questionnaire for urban water and sanitation projects. It provides detailed lists of the core and expanded questions that you can use for a typical urban and water supply survey. Although the survey toolkit presents various options in designing your questionnaire, the final design of your survey will still depend on your project objectives. Um, the inclusion of a CV survey in your expanded question should be treated as an additional design element for your survey. The contingent valuation survey or the willingness to pay survey has its own special requirements. It is often recommended to be conducted separately or if added to the typical socioeconomic survey, the willingness to pay questions or the contingent valuation section should be handled with more care and should at least have a well-designed CV scenario and properly framed questions for a more truthful revelation of the real value of the goods and service in question. So I'll stop here and let the next speaker discuss more in detail about the guidelines in implementing best practices on contingent valuation. So once again, good morning and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, James. Amy, I will now let me just share my screen. So everything okay with the screen share?
Yes, Asa, we can see it. Thank you.
Okay. So good morning. I'm Asa Sahise, and on behalf of the IREA CVM team, I will be talking about how to accurately capture willingness to pay in contingent valuation studies. Just to put the whole talk in context, CVM is or contingent valuation method is one of the stated preference methods used to value non-marketed benefits from projects, policies, and programs. So it is a stated preference or a stated preference method because value or WTP is obtained through letting people state their preference, usually through a survey. And the word contingent is coined because value or WTP is deduced or is contingent on a hypothetical market or scenario. So these two characteristics implies basically the need to design a survey questionnaire, as Jinra mentioned, specific to the CVM, and the need to construct a hypothetical market or scenario. The CVM gained prominence when an Exxon Valdez tanker ran aground in Alaska, and the ensuing oil spill caused an environmental catastrophe. This actually led to a court case between the state of Alaska and Exxon Valdez, wherein the state of Alaska won $2 billion in damages. And this value was largely obtained through a CVM study by Carson and others. And most of the uh, value of the damages was accounted for by passive use values. The This actually brought controversy and debate. In fact, during the litigation, the validity of the methodology was questioned, not surprisingly, during a conference organized by Exxon Valdez. So the back and forth controversy and debate led to the creation of a blue ribbon panel, or popularly known as the NOAA panel, which basically affirmed the validity of the method, given that a set of guidelines or standards will be followed. So, what was the debate all about? The heart of the contention were basically the biases associated with the method, primary of which is hypothetical bias, which is basically there means that there is always a difference between statements of value of people when faced with a hypothetical situation against an actual situation. So the other is that prominent one is strategic bias, wherein this is a situation wherein respondents are strategizing to influence results with the intention to free ride when the project is implemented. Other biases were also uh, identified, such as payment vehicle bias, information bias, and sampling bias. So, what does this biases mean? Well, basically, uh, the biases lead to non-truthful revelation of value, or WTP, in the survey. So this means that if this is present, then results of CVM studies are unreliable, and CVM estimates of non-marketed benefits are eventually biased. The evolution of the methodologies, starting from the NOAA panel to what it is now, are generally response to these biases. And the evolution has led to a set of recommended practices, and that it is said that CVM can only generate relatively unbiased estimates only if these recommended practices are followed, thereby making the whole exercise incentive compatible. The current recommendations are mostly centered on CV scenario design, survey implementation, um, which was already discussed by Jins and Amy, and on WTP estimation and uh, post estimation or validity checks. I will go now to the current recommendations on the three aspects which are marked in red. So the first recommendation for the CV scenario design is related to the description of the change in the goods or services to be valued. So the CV scenario must have a clear, credible, and consequential description of the change or improvement in the attribute levels of the goods and services that are being valued. On the table on the right, we can show the Wego na Tilake and Tachiri describe changes in the water quality and availability, clearly comparing the pre and post policy or project states of the water quality and availability. This is contrasted on the poor description on the left, which vaguely describes the changes in water quality, and also simply broadly describing the changes as well. It is also recommended that the description should be field contextualized and not be relegated to a desk work. The the institutional actors, those who will deliver the promised change, should also be mentioned. And how these actors will exactly deliver the promised changes should also be clearly stated. In other words, the project components or activity should also be stated clearly. Another part of the recommendation is on the elicitation format. The elicitation format is how the WTP question is asked. And this question is asked after describing the goods and services, as I mentioned there in the previous slides. The example of the right is an example of the single bound dichotomous choice in a referendum format, wherein the respondent is asked a yes or no question and is offered a randomized bid. So let me just read through it. Would you vote for the water services improvement plan if it means that you and your family will have to pay an additional amount of, and this is the randomized bid, to be added to your monthly water bill for improved water services? It's a referendum because it's in a referendum format because it is coined as a behavioral intention question, wherein the decision is actually to vote for a program or not that is promised to deliver the changes. It is generally recommended to avoid open-ended questions that is formats that ask respondents directly to freely state their willingness to pay. For instance, how much are you willing to pay for the water improvement? This is no longer recommended and practiced. Notice that in the previous slide, the CV question, I mentioned the surcharge on monthly payments. This is in CVM parlance, this is called the payment vehicle. And this is the method of payment or mechanism used to collect money to finance the hypothetical provision of the good. To avoid payment vehicle bias, the payment vehicle that is chosen should be inclusive. That is, everybody, when implemented, can be asked to pay. Credible, relevant, and neutral. There is no strong aversion to the payment mechanism, and the preference is to use surcharges and rather than total expenditure. Also note that the duration or frequency should also be clear. Is it a monthly payment, annual payment, or a one-time payment? It is also recommended to include cheap talk scripts. Cheap talk scripts are generally statements that remind respondents. So it reminds respondents on the nature of the hypothetical bias and the associated non-truthful revelation of value because of this hypothetical bias. So this in red, this is the reminder on that aspect. There is also a reminder about the budgetary constraints and that payment for the improvement of the water or improvement in the goods and services would mean that they would need to forego expenditures or other household expenditures or consumption. And this is the one in red here. It is also recommended that in the CV scenario, especially if it is in a referendum format, to identify a provision point mechanism or a provision point. The provision point is the rule that is the decision rule or the trigger wherein the goods will be delivered or the improvement in the goods or services will be delivered. On the right, the provision point mechanism is that or provision point rule is that if 60% of the 60% of the household or the project will be implemented if 60% of the household will be voting for the program. The studies have found that this addresses the strategic behavior or strategic bias resulting from a free riding behavior. So the idea is actually to make the questions feel binding to the respondents. The final set of recommendation is to include debriefing questions. And these debriefing questions are actually asked after the CV question or after eliciting the WTP. Debriefing questions are meant to filter uncertainty. And this is a debriefing question related to that, to basically ask how certain the respondents are in their answer to the CV question. It is also meant to identify protest votes, and this is an example of a debriefing question to identify protest votes. Protest votes are those no answers to the referendum, and the reason of which is aside from budgetary constraint and things that are related to the preference of the individual. Uh, Debriefing questions are also meant to filter perception on scenario consequentiality. On the right, it asks whether respondents feel that the CV scenario is consequential both in terms of the price that they will be paying, as well as whether the policy will be actually be implemented by a local government or the stakeholders. So another set of recommendations are related, apart from the CV scenario design, are related to analyzing the data after the survey. So these are basically related to uh, standard econometric practices or good best practices in econometrics, such as the choice of the regression model should match the data generated by the elicitation format. For instance, the single bound dichotomous choice, because it produces a discrete dependent variable, should be estimated using either logit or probit regressions. Other standard econometric practices are also recommended, such as using specification tests to pinpoint the final model, to be wary of the signs of the regression coefficients, whether they correspond to expectations or theory, and on sample size, that it needs to ensure sufficient sample power to basically estimate the effects of the regressors, or basically to have confidence on the accuracy of your coefficients. Um, Finally, it's also important to document all these steps and leading to the final regression equation and report them as well. So after the WTP or willingness to pay is calculated, the validity of the results is also recommended to be checked. This would include checking whether the results conform to theory, such as whether income and WTP have a positive relationship, or income and the likelihood of agreeing to a randomized bid has a positive relationship. The bid and the likelihood of having the likelihood of agreeing to a randomized offered bid should also be exhibiting a behavior that is that looks like the figure on the right. That is, the percentage of yes votes should be decreasing as the bid increases, or the randomized bid offered increases. The need to also account for the protest votes, because you have debriefing questions on protest. You need to verify relationship with other variables as well, such as sociodemographics, knowledge of the good, attitudes, and usually you do that to cross tabulations. And finally, to demonstrate the external validity, that is comparing the WTP estimates from other methods and studies as well. So let me conclude by asking why we need to follow the standards as well. First, because it leads to high quality estimates of non-market benefits. Once you have this, I guess the discourse then shifts, or the focus then shifts to the question of whether the estimates are valid or not, to what the numbers or the estimates actually tell us. And these numbers actually can tell us a lot of things. It can tell us what the optimal user charge or tariff should be. It could also determine demand or buy-in. It can help us understand trade-offs between different project and options. And finally, it can also be a mechanism for advocacy and dialogue to increase attention, basically, on non-marketed goods and services, for instance, on the environment and water ecosystems that are affected by projects. Finally, it's about opportunity. ADB conducts numerous thematic CVM studies in different regions, which provide unique opportunities as well. For instance, you can you can have cross-country comparability of studies across similar thematic areas, and this can inform policy and actually even the direction of the methodology itself. And the lack of a consistent observation or use of good practices limits the potential to contribute to this opportunity. Finally, high quality studies can form an evidence base from which other low cost or cost efficient methods such as benefit transfer can draw from. So with that, I end my presentation, and I thank you very much. For more information, you can consult our contingent valuation book, which is downloadable from the ADB website. And I think David would also like to add some more. David?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit of a larger picture comment. Basically, for project economic analysis, contingent valuation has often been considered an exercise appended on to other data collection processes. It's something that is done sort of quickly. The questionnaires are extensions of questionnaires that are conducted for safeguard purposes or poverty and social analysis purposes. Basically, what I would say the larger takeaway from this kind of guideline would be that we can't get reliable estimates just with contingent valuation as an afterthought. It's something that requires substantial resources to do properly. It's something that it's its own area of work, and it needs to be resourced appropriately if it's to give reliable estimates. Contingent valuation, if not conducted well, can give a lot of nonsense. It can give useful information if it is conducted well, but to conduct it well requires that it's taken seriously. So it's a different approach that we would need to contingent valuation for it to play a really useful role in terms of informing project design and giving a useful basis for meaningful decisions. So if you look at these guidelines, they do imply a change to the kind of practice we would have at ADB. Thank you.
Okay, we will now open the floor for questions. We have a few in already in our Q&A box. Number 1 from Patricia Paula Seriritan is a question to Amy. May I ask which area was presented in the last slide, and may I confirm that the data presented was the household survey for 2020? Amy?
Thanks, Ada. I'd like to pass it on to Trang to give her a chance to present. Thanks, Trang.
Thank you very much, Amy, and apologies that I got dropped out earlier. This last slide that Amy presented was for Baguio City, as you know, a city in the Philippines, and that was the household survey, as you said, of about 1,000 households that we did in 2020. Thank you.
All right, on to our next question. Is there any suggestion about typically how many questions can there be in surveys? This is open to anybody.
Yeah.
Who would like
Del,
to?
would you like to, or Asa, would you like to take it? Because
I think I can.
Yes, Del, so we can.
Yeah, I can help answer
Please
the
go
question.
ahead.
Instead of putting it a number of questions, I would rather say what is because you usually take 45 minutes at the maximum for a survey. So questions could differ. First of all, if you have a question that is hard to answer, it may take more than a minute. But if it's a yes or no question, it's easy to answer that. And second, there are skip logics, or there are questions that you need not ask the respondents. So whatever questions you can fit with a 45-minute time frame would be most doable. So that would require you to prioritize which of the questions are most relevant to answer your project objectives. So I think that's my answer.
Thank you, Del. Isa, do you have any inputs for that?
I think specific to CVM is more of the components and the practices rather than the number of questions. I think that's what is more important in CVM. There are specific questions like debriefing questions that are standard to most CVM questions, but the CV scenario itself, what is in there is basically field dependent, and of course there are certain aspects that, like what I mentioned earlier.
All right, I see David has his hand up. David?
Yeah, so I don't think there's it depends on the context and the availability and the time period for respondents. I tend to do for impact evaluation quite detailed surveys, and those surveys may last 2 hours, but you have to schedule them at the time during which respondents aren't busy. So, for example, if it's an agricultural survey, it would have to be in a time when it's not planting, harvesting, etc. You may have to compensate respondents, but it's not only a question of time frame; it's also a question of having questions not require computations from respondents when they're trying to answer and put things together. So often you have to go to a longer questionnaire in order to avoid the mental calculations, because you want to ask each individual item in a way that the respondent doesn't make calculation errors in their head, so that then you do the calculation based on the data that you receive. But there's no universal answer. And sometimes you have to go back and revisit multiple times if you need to do so to get sufficient information. But it's basically a pre-testing process to see, how much patience respondents have, and how you can keep their attention on good answers.
Okay, thank you, David. And I'd like to thank Jagdish Damanya for that last question. On to one from Christian Walder. Thank you for the interesting presentations. The willingness to pay can change quickly over time. Example, between the time the survey was done versus the time the project is being implemented. What are strategies and approaches to overcome this limitation?
Okay. Thank you, Ada. Let me take a first dig at answering that. The CVM is actually best when there is less uncertainty about project components and project interventions. So in that case, that there is sort of a high degree of uncertainty between the survey and the possibly the project components itself. One strategy or one other stated preference method is the choice experiment, which actually allows you to change the attributes of not only the because in CVM you have certain attributes and fixed levels. So if the levels of the attributes change across time between the survey and the final implementation of the project, then there is less information in terms of CVM. But with say choice experiments, you can also vary the levels of the attributes itself, so it leads to more flexible results, and you can actually possibly account for changes in the project or the program as well, because you have different levels even after the survey.
Thank you, Asa. Amy, do you have something to add?
Yes, I'd just like to add that ADB conducts also project completion reports. So when projects are finished, usually we reconduct economic analysis. And if there is a willingness to pay component in that, that is usually project teams have two options. So that is the usual approach is to keep the original willingness to pay and use that to re-estimate. So the benefits And when I say it's after the project, it's been years since the project has been implemented and the original willingness to pay has been taken. So, but the second option is for project teams to also reconduct a willingness to pay survey if there is sufficient proof that the willingness to pay has varied from the initial time that the survey was undertaken until the time that the reevaluation is being taken. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. We have another question from John Brady. Do you initiate your survey after public outreach efforts for a project where the public outreach is for the purpose of educating the public on the benefits of the project? Also, does your survey identify whether the survey respondent is a property owner or a property renter? Owners look to increase value of their property while renters look for increased value to their living conditions. Who would like to answer this question?
I think this would go to Del and Jindra. Can you repeat the first question, Ada? These are 3 questions, I believe.
So first would be, do you initiate your survey after public outreach efforts for a project where the public outreach is for the purpose of educating the public on the benefits of the project?
Okay, no, that would be for Trang. Trang, do we initiate surveys after public outreach? So Trang would have had more experience in this kind. So Trang.
Thank you, Amy. I think it really depends on the project. So, for example, again, in Baguio City, we have a component focusing on campaign and behavior change, and we developed a communication strategy for behavior change. So for that purpose, yes, we would do surveys and we will conduct, before and after the campaigns. But I would say that it's not always the case. We don't always have this luxury in every project. Ideally, we could do it, before and after. But as I said, it really depends. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Trang. The second part of the question was, does your survey identify whether the survey respondent is a property owner or a property renter? Owners look to increase value of their property while renters look for increased value to their living conditions.
Okay, I think this would be for Del. Del, do we have questions? I think it's referring to our survey questionnaire, the one in the survey toolkit. Do we have a question on ownership?
It's part of the social demographic variables, but we leave it to the users to identify which is relevant for them for disaggregation. I think this it depends if it's a policy of interest in terms of sampling design. Normally we don't. We look at only connected, non-connected households or those of different income levels, but not distinguish them according to whether they're property owners or renters. But I'm not familiar with other survey questionnaires if are doing this in the implementation stage. So perhaps Chang or Jindra could add to this.
I could also add that normally you would, that's a basic characteristic that you should have in such a questionnaire, right? You would have questions about the property assets, et cetera. So there are many variables you typically ask about the household. So this would be a typical question in these questionnaires.
Okay, thank you, Del and David, for your inputs. Another question we have from Leylan. Nowadays, online survey has been increasingly used and will take place of traditional face-to-face survey in the future. Would this guideline be applicable to design and implement an online survey as well?
Del?
Yeah, I think not all of them, because you won't be needing your enumerators to do the survey for you. I think doing online surveys has its own advantages and disadvantages, so you have to be careful. And I don't think that in the near future it will replace the traditional face-to-face surveys at some extent, perhaps, but we will be using more of the computer-assisted personal interviews, I guess, and not the pen and paper surveys. So yes, you will change the guidelines. Some of it are not anymore applicable to web or online surveys.
Okay, thank you very much, Del. Does
Yeah.
anybody have anything to
Ada,
add?
yeah, can I just add
Okay,
on
Janelle,
that?
go ahead.
During this pandemic, it's been the telephone interview and also the individual like survey that has been conducted more effectively because of this pandemic. But I think the guideline sort of like provides you some kind of like a generic tips wherein that points out like crucial points wherein uh, crucial points wherein you need to like design your survey. For the online, I think it would be different as compared with the face to face, but then the face to face will still be the optimal type of survey that will be implemented in the future. But for the online, yeah, it's kind of like a different animal as compared to the paper and copy.
Thank you, Jens. Okay.
I can add just something quickly, and that is in terms of if it's contingent valuation, it's the important thing is that the exercise is felt to be binding for the respondent. And it would be hard to see for these kind of public goods and services how an online platform would necessarily be viewed as so binding. That said, in terms of choice modeling for other kinds of goods, there are choice modeling kinds of choice experiments that are conducted online for goods that would be closer to marketed types of goods. So it's not impossible, but in the context of a public sector project, it's difficult to see online platforms being used in developing countries for these surveys.
Let me add some additional insights for those. Actually, if it's not possible to have a face-to-face interviews, what we often do, even in CV studies, is to do the drop-off method to give time for respondents to think. You leave the questionnaire to them and you come back later. So that's one option if it's not possible to have contact with the respondent and enumerator. So an option that others perhaps might be willing to consider. So thank you.
Thank you, David and Del. Okay, can we now move on to the next question from Anne Aubrey Bugtong. How different is willingness to pay from capacity to pay in terms of its use in coming up with tariff?
Let me take a first cut at that. WTP is value. So when we talk about value, that considers people's ability to pay, their budget constraint, as well as their preferences. So when they say that they are not willing to pay or they're not agreeing to a bid that is offered to them, theoretically, both the ability to pay, the budget constraint, and the preference are already considered in that decision. So basically, what we consider as value is the difference between what they're willing to pay and what they're actually going to pay, which is basically their consumer surplus. So once you know that consumer surplus, you can do several things to that. It can be a demonstrated value. So in that case, you plug that into your NPV calculation or whatnot, or you can appropriate that value. Then it becomes a transfer from the consumer to probably another entity like the government. So I guess the WTP is more of the basis for dialogue on what the actual tariff should be.
Okay, thank you, Asa. Amy, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Ada. So coming from practice, we usually see at IREA, we see some project teams that confuse affordability or ability to pay with willingness to pay. So we see some of them presenting results of affordability. The question in the survey was, could you afford a 150 rupee increase, whereas it is not the willingness to pay. So it was not, it's not the proper value. So what we usually do is also ask them to conduct. So once you do a willingness to pay, you know the value. We also ask them to conduct an affordability analysis to check whether actually the value that they cited is affordable, meaning what proportion is that of their monthly income, for example. So there's a difference in that, and we try to hopefully with this CVM book we can enlighten that there's a difference between that, and they should not be mistaken for the other.
Thank you, Amy. Okay, next question from Marilyn De Leon. To implement water pricing, how necessary is the WTP survey? Can it be dispensed with? That will be in addition to public consultations.
The willingness to pay, or CVM, is actually very good when you have public goods or externalities. So when in terms of water, probably if you're looking at changing water supply through investments, probably because you already have existing demand, you probably can work on that, because CVM is a very tedious, expensive undertaking. So it has to be chosen chosen appropriately, and one of the parameters of your choice or your decision is basically the type of good that you are valuing. So if it's water supply, or simply just increase in supply because of investments, then probably a demand analysis would suffice. The other is consideration is if you have budget and time. If you don't, then probably you could look at other techniques such as benefit transfers. If there is a good study that fits the study site, of course, there's a lot of things that you need to consider before you can transfer the benefits. Then that is another one. Whether this is an addition to public consultations, actually, in my experience, the number that you get from CVM actually becomes the basis for dialogue. It becomes the basis for negotiations. For instance, when we work with payment for environmental services, we don't come in saying that this is the amount that you're going to pay. So this is the maximum willingness to pay of people, and the negotiation actually would end up to something lower than that, probably. So yeah, it is in tandem with public consultations. That is, you use the results of the method to start dialogue in your public consultations.
Thank you, Asa. Would any of our other presenters like to add to that? I'll just move on to the next question. From Genevieve Guinel. What is the ideal number of questions to ask?
I think it was answered last time on the second question.
Okay, all right.
Yes, I think it all depends on the objectives of your survey, actually. So there's really no definite number of questions that we could recommend. So it really depends on, the overall objective and what policy questions you would want to have out of the survey.
Let me just also add something. It depends on if it's contingent valuation on what your regressors are, right? And some regressors themselves require actually a lot of information in order to be able to put together. So, for example, if one of your regressors is likely to be income, getting income, if it's in the context of sort of informal sector income, own account activities, or agriculture, may itself require lots and lots of questions. If it's in the context of formal sector employees who have, clear wages and whatnot, then it may not require so many questions. So it depends on what you need to be able to have the regressors characterized precisely and accurately enough for the estimation that you want to perform. But in the context of most developing countries where a lot of income is informal, own account, et cetera, then that often requires many questions to capture sufficient detail to understand, especially if it's also seasonally varied, et cetera. Thank you.
Yeah, just to add a few more on what David said. This is also one of the reason why we developed the survey toolkit. So we sort of come up with the core questions. Usually those core questions it cuts across the different similar project for water. So usually the core question comprise of like 10 or 15 questions. But then we also come up with the expanded questions wherein for every unique or specific components, we add on these questions to the core question. So, but still in the end, there's really no definite number of questions. It all depends on your objective. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, for the last question, I'm sorry, not the last question. One just came in. This one is from Ina Dalosa. Usually the survey respondents are the ones who are available in the house at the time of such surveys, who may not be concerned about the household finances / budget. Example, a housekeeper, an unemployed relative. How can we ensure the accuracy of the survey results, given that those who are paying the bills are typically unavailable due to work or other business?
I think you have to define clearly who are eligible respondents from the very start, and avoid interviewing those who are not eligible for the survey. It could be the husband, the wife, or the caretaker. But that's why you have to plan the timing of the interview. So if it requires you to do it at the afternoon, then by all means you have to move your schedules or early morning. So it's very, very crucial at the very start of the project implementation or the survey that you know who are the eligible respondents. There's a checklist before you administer the questionnaire to avoid interviewing those who are not eligible.
Okay, thank you, Del.
Let me just add to that as well. The other thing that we usually encounter this during in rural areas where they are farming early in the morning and goes back in the afternoon or in the evening. The other is to set appointments and then come back to the household. So that's one. The other thing that we do is we sometimes track them in their farms and just ask politely for their time as well. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Isa. Next question. Water pricing as part of the water demand management versus water pricing brought about by investments / improvements. I don't know if that's really a question, but if anybody would like to take this one.
Can you repeat? Yeah, Isa, you got it. Would you like to take a stab?
Yeah, I can see it. From my perspective, water demand management and pricing from investments and improvements are somewhat related. For you to say that an investment is actually worth taking, basically you want to ensure that that people actually prefer those changes or those improvements. So that's my take on that. I might be confused on the question, but I think that's my take on that question. it's not an either or, but I think these two are related. And CVM is only a means by which you can sort of address both.
Okay, thank you, Asa. Now we have another question from Sherilyn. How is CVM different from economic valuation, especially relative to natural resources like water?
They're basically CVM is the same. It's an economic valuation methodology. So whether you're, well, of course, it depends on the good. So for water investment, for instance, it has to, the good that you're addressing needs to have either be in a form of an externality or has some public good characteristics. In that case, markets would fail to adequately capture preferences in that case. In natural resources, for instance, forest conservation, water becomes basically an externality of your conservation because of the ecological processes. So CVM fits naturally into that. Actually, it's CVM has been applied to basically on resources conservation. So there is no difference. It's just a methodology to capture value for certain types of goods.
Okay, thank you, Asa. Okay, I see we've got about 5 minutes left in our time, so I'll proceed to the last question from Paul Stevenson. Does the WTP help determine if a higher tariff would be actually paid if there was a commensurate increase in quality of water service provision?
I think that's one of the key objectives or questions that CVM actually answers, whether we have adequate demand for improvements or adequate preferences, value for improvements. And basically, as I've said, you can demonstrate that as a means of saying that there are indeed intangible benefits. So in that case, it's demonstrative use of value, or you can appropriate that. In that case, that is the case where you have resort to appropriating part of that value or a part of that benefit for tariff setting.
Okay, thank you, Asa, once again. All right, so that is it for our question and answer part. Before we do anything else, I'd like to turn it over to Amy for closing the session.
Thanks, Ada, for your great moderation. Thank you to our panel, Jindra, Asa, Del, David, Trang, for this, and Srini, of course, for a really wonderful enlightening discussion that we had today. I'd like to just, I don't have a lot to say except watch out for the handbooks that are coming. So the first one is the Survey Toolkit. It is a guide for socioeconomic surveys in urban development and water sector. It's going to be available very soon. It's a very light document. You can bring it to the field. You can use it for training purposes and for instruction purposes. Also, watch out for the handbook for contingent valuation methodology, which is also underway now. So this will also be very much available in the ADB website very soon. So these are two exciting publications that we will have that will hopefully support and improve the quality of data gathering and capturing willingness to pay of urban development and water supply projects in Asia and the Pacific. So with that, I'd like to close our session and thank you everyone again. Please feel free to contact us if you have any concerns, issues, questions, and we will be happy to respond. Thank you so much, everyone, and good afternoon.